Hello, thank you for attending our monthly history presentation. This evening, I will be reading two articles written by Joseph F. Carpenter in early 1961. In total, Joseph wrote 20 articles in the series. Joseph, or Joe as I knew him, donated the collection to the Overbrook United Methodist Church, which I discovered as I was looking for information on the former parsonage. Before I begin, I would like to apologize for not being there in person, but when work calls, you must go. I would like to introduce myself to you. If you do not know me, my name is Jessica Fry. My grandparents were Frank and Irene Moeller, and my parents are Joe and Deborah Rose. My husband Andy and son Ashton, a junior at Santa Fe Trail High School, and I all live on a portion of the original family farm located just south of 109th and Ratner Road. I found a published map in 1918 that showed my great-grandfather Henry's property. Our oldest son, Gabriel, lives in Lawrence and is completing his PhD in aeronautical engineering at the University of Kansas. You have seen and will be seeing several maps during my presentation that I have put together with resources from Historic MapWorks, an online website, a list that our historian, Loretta Warren, provided, and memories from those who grew up in Overbrook. Before I begin the article, I would like to send my sincerest thank you to Patty Colson, Judy Martin, my aunt, and Dale Fox for their memories of specific locations in 1961. And to Darren Jones, a big thank you for recording this and weaving the maps into the recording so you would have some context on locations I will be speaking about. Enough about me. Let's get into the two articles you came to hear. The first article is titled, Overbrook, the Railroad, and Joe Kaufman, all 75 this year. This is the sixth in a series of feature stories concerning the history of Kansas, Osage County, and the Overbrook community, written by Joseph F. Carpenter, Chairman and Centennial History Committee, and a retired principal of Overbrook High School. Overbrook is the youngest town in the county. This week, we will give a few points as to how it started. Then we will have a center around which to build our later stories. First, let it be understood that we are not attempting to belittle, copy, or detract from the history of Overbrook, written and published by J.D. Quillen in 1893. It is well written and well illustrated. We suggest you get a copy and read it. Our effort here is to give only a brief background history. Since it is 75 years since Joe Kaufman was born, a son of one of the town's founders, and since it is 75 years since both the coming of the railroad and the platting of the town, it is fitting that with our centennial celebration of Kansas, that we of Overbrook celebrate, in all capital letters by the way, three-way diamond jubilee. Very little documentary evidence is available, so we are relying on the memory and accuracy of people who have been kind enough to relate their stories and permit us to read their write-ups. From this information, permit us then to do a little mental dramatization of our own. If you care to express it otherwise, power to you. The time, place, and characters are very important. The action might well start 75 years ago, midway across Elk Township from east to west along the old Santa Fe Trail, later US 50 North, and now US 56 Highway. Exactly in the center of Elk Township ran a much-traveled road from north to south. Just south of where these two roads intersect lay two level quarter sections of virgin land. On the west side of the road, in the spring of 1886, it was planted to corn and owned by J.B. Fairchild. On the east side of the road, it was planted to wheat and owned by T.W. Kaufman. The summer before, these two men had given the K&D, now Missouri Pacific Railroad, the right-of-way across their farms. The railroad had been surveyed in 1885, and by spring of 1886, the graders were working across the Alvin Miller, Charles Reed, and Will Banta farms. A plot of ground just west of the Banta farm was a tent town where the workers lived and kept their mules, horses, and equipment. They used old Flag Springs on the Miller farm as their source of water. One day in May of 1886, Mr. Kaufman and Mr. Fairchild were visiting over the fence and feeling rather jubilant over their crop prospects. Mr. Kaufman said, "Jap, could you guess what happened at our house last night? We had a little boy born to us. We're going to call him Joe." "Well, that's great, Bill. So you're going to call him Joe?" Says Bill, "That calls for a little celebrating. Look what I got here in my pocket. You know, Bill, I've been thinking lately, and last night I put my idea on paper. Now, since we're going to have a railroad, right here on this ridge where we are standing would make a fine place to locate a town. I could lay out 25 or 30 acres, mostly north of the railroad, and you could lay out about the same acreage. We could have it platted and start selling lots. What think you? Let me take your drawings and study a few days. You may have something here, Jap." "Sure, Bill, and talk it over with Joe." As Jap walked off, he was musing, maybe twins were born today. About 10 days later, the two men met near the intersection of the highway and the new railroad. Both men were agreed and enthusiastic to get the new town started. "Well, Jap, I told Joe all about our plan for a new town, and I couldn't understand a word he said. But I think he wants to call our new town Sunflower City. Quite appropriate, don't you think?" "Not a bad idea, Bill, but why not call it Jasper City? That sounds more like my namesake." As they were discussing a possible name, one of the railroad officials overheard their discussion and joined in. "Since you are not agreed on a name for your new town, why don't you name it after my hometown back in Pennsylvania, Overbrook?" "Well, Jap, that sounds good to me. What do you say?" "Bill, you know, we don't always agree, but go home and tell Joe it's Overbrook." Our second article this evening is titled, "Overbrook Begins to Build as Railroad Comes to New Town." This is the seventh of a series of feature stories concerning the history of Kansas, Osage County, and the Overbrook community, written by Joseph F. Carpenter, chairman of the Centennial History Committee and retired principal of the Overbrook High School. Mrs. Molly Adler states that in 1886, she, as a child, lived where the grade school now stands, and is probably the only living person that was present when the original town site of Overbrook was platted. Her father, Frank Houston, moved a 4-room building in from Carbondale, and she still lives in this house. Wellington Greenfield says, "It was a great sight as he watched the steel horse pull the first train through Overbrook. He thinks that B.G.B. Jackson was the first agent. Mr. Greenfield says, regardless of some opposition to the railroad, it was the best thing to ever hit Overbrook." Bob Adams, a carpenter, built the first new residence in Overbrook. It is now the home of Lottie Harris. The first business house was by William Kincaid, who opened a grocery store where the Kansas State Bank now stands. In 1887, W.T. Kaufman and Bert Schramm started handling groceries, dry goods, boots, and shoes. The same year, the Grange established a store where the Alvin Miller store now stands. This store handled general merchandise, farm products, and machinery. The first hotel was built by Mr. Kelsey, where Jess Bean now lives. Kelsey also established the first livery stable where Shep's Garage is now located. Another hotel was located about where Mrs. Marshall's home now stands. It was owned by James Adams. In 1890, it was taken over by Henry Platt from Carbondale. The first lumber yard was established in 1887 on the site of the present one by James Kirkwood. Who also built the house now owned by Bert Wilson. Andy Thompson moved a building in and started a blacksmith shop near Herbert Stoner's present location. A milliner's store was opened about where Morgan's dry goods store now operates by Mr. Woods, who also built the house now owned by Mamie Kaufman. Joseph V. Redd, father of Charles Redd, was the town's last surviving member of the Grand Army of the Republic. In 1889, the Overbrook Herald was started. The reporter had a brief stay during 1893. The Overbrook Citizen was established in 1898 by J.D. Quinlan, who was the author of the history of Overbrook mentioned and recommended in last week's letter. The first bank was opened by Charles Clary from Carbondale in May of 1889. It operated as a private bank until December of 1891, when it was reorganized as the Kansas State Bank, with J.M. Egan, president, and E.J. Hilke, cashier. N. Kessler had a long record with the bank. The same Mr. Hilke, in 1897, organized the Farmers State Bank, now the First National Bank of Overbrook, and in current times is the First Security Bank. W.T. Kaufman, Jacob Batsky, Lon Bryson, W.M. Baldwin, and J.M. Hollis served as directors. J.A. Courts became cashier in 1905, and that position has been in the family ever since. Cyrus Beard built the first elevator, wind-powered, near Toucher's warehouse. Where the Standard Oil tanks now stand, Kirk Mason owned a carpenter shop and the best planing mill in the country. He also made cob pipes. A slaughterhouse was established just south of the sale barn. It was owned by Abe Fulkerson. Later, one was started on the Charles Ware farm. A slaughterhouse was established just south of the sale barn. It was owned by Abe Fulkerson. Later, one was started on the Charles Ware farm. According to the Overbrook Citizen's issue of June 3rd, 1926, Harvey Snyder was the first child born in Overbrook on April 8th, 1888. There seems to be some question as to the first physician and druggist. A Dr. Harrow is mentioned. A man called Dr. Carpenter moved a building in and carried a few drugs, but was later absorbed by Mr. Topping. Dr. Main may have been the first real doctor. He moved here from a practice in Carbondale. Harvey Huggins was the first undertaker, followed by Frank Ernst, father of Mrs. Frank Carnes. In about 1901, Lewis Kaufman submitted the town's slogan, "Don't Overlook Overbrook," in a contest conducted by the Chamber of Commerce. That was the end of the second article. However, as I was researching, I wanted to point out a few other points of interest from that time. The original school within Overbrook was shown on the map from 1899 and was located at the corner of 5th and Elm. There was a creamerer located right off of Maple Street along Walnut. And finally, the Methodist Episcopal Church was located at the corner of Santa Fe Trail and Walnut, and the Congregational Church was located about 2 blocks north along Walnut. Thank you all for your time this evening, and I will turn it back over to the board members who are present.